You think you know the most scandalous Roman emperor? Nero didn't just burn down Rome and fiddle while it happened. This man castrated a young boy, dressed him as his wife, and married him in front of cheering crowds. Then he went ahead and married another man, taking the role of bride himself. These weren't secret ceremonies hidden in palace shadows. These were state-sponsored spectacles that turned the Roman Empire into Nero's personal theater of the absurd. Palace records show us a 17-year-old boy clutching imperial power while his mother pulled every string behind the throne. Agrippina the Younger had clawed her way through Roman politics with the determination of someone who knew that hesitation meant death. She'd already survived multiple emperors, watched family members fall to poison and plotting, and now she held the ultimate prize within reach. The young Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus wasn't supposed to inherit anything. Born into a world where bloodlines meant everything and adoption could change your destiny overnight, he watched his mother orchestrate one of history's most calculated power grabs. Agrippina married her own uncle, Emperor Claudius, in a move that would make modern political strategists dizzy with admiration. Palace whispers described her as the real ruler long before her son ever wore the purple. When Claudius conveniently died in 54 AD, those same whispers turned to poison. Agrippina had fed her husband mushrooms laced with enough toxins to drop a gladiator, though she maintained her innocent widow act perfectly. Historical accounts from Tacitus paint the scene with brutal clarity. A mother so hungry for power she'd murder her own husband to crown her teenage son. 17-year-old Nero found himself ruler of the known world almost overnight. The Senate, still reeling from Claudius's sudden death, welcomed the young emperor with cautious optimism. Here was a chance for stability after the chaos of previous reigns. Early proclamations promised reform, justice, and a return to traditional Roman values. The boy emperor even had decent advisors: Seneca the philosopher and Burrus the military commander, both men who understood that Rome needed steady leadership. Those first years delivered exactly what Rome craved. Nero reduced taxes, expanded citizens' rights, and funded public works that actually improved daily life. He listened to the Senate, respected traditional ceremonies, and behaved like emperors were supposed to behave. Historical records from this period read like a textbook example of responsible governance. Citizens who had braced for another tyrant instead found themselves with a ruler who seemed genuinely interested in their welfare. But power does strange things to teenage minds, especially when that power extends over millions of lives and endless wealth. Court observers began noticing subtle changes in the young emperor's behavior. He spent longer hours at gladiatorial games, showed increasing interest in theatrical performances, and started questioning why emperors had to follow the same boring protocols as their predecessors. The advisors who'd guided his early success found themselves competing with flattering courtiers, who told Nero exactly what 17-year-olds want to hear: that rules are for ordinary people. Agrippina watched her carefully orchestrated plans beginning to crumble. The son she'd murdered for was developing ideas of his own, and those ideas didn't include sharing power with anyone, especially not the mother who'd put him on the throne. Palace tensions escalated from quiet disagreements to open confrontation. Mother and son, bound together by blood and ambition, were about to discover that shared guilt makes for unstable partnerships. Roman citizens noticed their stable young emperor becoming increasingly unpredictable. What they couldn't possibly foresee was how far that unpredictability would eventually take him. Traditional Roman emperors maintained careful dignity, balancing their public image with the weight of absolute power. Nero threw that playbook out entirely. Within a few years of his coronation, palace records show an emperor who treated his position like an unlimited entertainment budget rather than a sacred responsibility. The teenage ruler who'd once listened respectfully to Senate debates now spent his afternoons performing on stage, singing to audiences who applauded because refusing meant death. Roman society had strict rules about what emperors could and couldn't do. Acting, singing, and racing chariots were considered beneath imperial dignity, suitable only for slaves and social outcasts. Nero didn't just break these conventions, he shattered them with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered fire. Historical accounts describe him forcing senators to watch his musical performances, their faces frozen in terrified appreciation, while their emperor sang tragic ballads dressed in theatrical costumes. The palace transformed into something between a royal court and a never-ending festival. Nero hosted banquets that lasted for days, with guests gorging themselves on delicacies imported from across the empire. We're talking about dinners where peacock tongues were appetizers, and wine flowed in quantities that would bankrupt entire provinces. Suetonius recorded feasts where the emperor served dishes garnished with pearls dissolved in vinegar, each meal costly enough to feed a small city for months. Sexual excess became another arena where Nero rewrote imperial protocol. Previous emperors had kept their private lives relatively private, maintaining at least the appearance of traditional Roman morality. Nero treated sexuality like another form of public entertainment. Palace staff whispered about orgies that included senators' wives, elaborate brothels set up within the imperial residence, and sexual games that turned political meetings into debauchery sessions. The emperor's passion for performance art reached levels that horrified traditional Romans. He didn't just attend plays, he wrote them, starred in them, and forced the empire's most powerful citizens to participate. Picture Rome's military commanders and wealthy merchants squeezed into theatrical costumes, reciting lines under threat of execution if they forgot their cues. These weren't private hobby performances. Nero opened imperial theaters to the public, charging admission for citizens to watch their leadership perform like trained entertainers. Chariot racing became another obsession that scandalized Roman society. Emperors were supposed to watch races from the imperial box, maintaining dignified distance from the sweating, dangerous sport. Nero climbed into the chariots himself, racing against professional drivers while crowds held their breath. Historical records show he actually fell out of his chariot during one race, nearly getting trampled by horses, but still insisted on being declared the winner. Administrative duties suffered as Nero's attention shifted entirely to personal indulgence. Senate meetings were postponed so the emperor could rehearse his latest musical composition. Provincial governors sent urgent dispatches about barbarian invasions, only to receive responses about Nero's upcoming theatrical debut. The machinery of empire continued functioning, but barely, held together by bureaucrats who learned to make crucial decisions without consulting their increasingly absent ruler. The financial drain was staggering. Rome's treasury, carefully built up through generations of conquest and taxation, hemorrhaged gold to fund Nero's endless spectacles. Every public performance required elaborate sets, imported materials, and payments to audiences who were essentially paid to pretend they enjoyed watching their emperor embarrass himself. Palace expenditures during this period exceeded the annual budgets of entire provinces. Roman citizens watched their emperor's transformation with growing unease. The promising young ruler had become something unprecedented, a leader who seemed more interested in applause than governance, more concerned with artistic legacy than military strength. They had no idea that Nero's most shocking performances were still to come. The emperor's grief consumed him completely, but what came next defied every boundary of Roman morality. Nero found a young boy named Sporus whose face reminded him of his beloved Poppaea Sabina. What the emperor did to this child remains one of history's most disturbing acts of imperial power run wild. Sporus was just a boy when Nero decided to remake him into the image of his dead wife. The emperor ordered the child's castration, a brutal procedure that in ancient Rome carried enormous risks. Without modern medical knowledge or sterile conditions, castration meant cutting away the testicles with crude instruments while the victim remained conscious. Many died from blood loss or infection during the agonizing healing process that followed. But Sporus survived. Once he recovered, Nero dressed him in women's clothing and jewelry, styling his hair like an empress. The boy was given the finest silk gowns, precious gems, and all the trappings of imperial femininity. Nero even had him wear Poppaea's own robes and jewelry, creating a living ghost of his deceased wife. The transformation went far beyond clothing. Nero insisted everyone at court address Sporus as empress, speak to him with the formal respect due to an imperial wife, and treat him as if he were actually Poppaea reborn. Palace servants were ordered to escort him with the full ceremony reserved for the emperor's consort. Sporus had become a grotesque puppet in Nero's theater of mourning and control. When Nero felt ready, he announced his intention to marry the boy in a full Roman wedding ceremony. This wasn't a private ritual hidden away in the palace. The emperor planned a massive public celebration with all the pageantry typically reserved for uniting two of Rome's most powerful families. The wedding took place with senators, military commanders, and foreign dignitaries in attendance. Sporus wore a bridal veil and was given away like any Roman bride, complete with the traditional ceremonies and feast. Nero treated the entire affair as legitimate, speaking his vows as if he were truly marrying Poppaea's spirit returned to earth. After the ceremony, Sporus accompanied Nero everywhere as his empress. They traveled together in the imperial litter, attended state functions side by side, and Nero expected his court to treat their marriage as completely legitimate. The castrated boy sat beside the emperor during official meetings, wore the jewelry of Roman empresses, and lived as Nero's wife in every public sense. But this bizarre union represented more than just one man's twisted grief. Sporus had become a symbol of Nero's absolute power over his subjects' bodies and lives. The emperor could take a freeborn child, mutilate him, dress him in women's clothing, and force the entire Roman establishment to pretend this was normal imperial behavior. The young empress lived in a strange twilight existence, neither male nor female, neither slave nor free citizen, but something entirely new that Nero had created to satisfy his own psychological needs. Palace records show Sporus accompanied the emperor to theatrical performances, gladiator games, and state dinners, always dressed as a woman and treated as Nero's legitimate wife. Most disturbing of all, contemporary sources suggest Sporus seemed to accept his role. Whether through genuine affection, Stockholm syndrome, or simple survival instinct, the boy who had been remade into an empress appeared to embrace his bizarre fate. He had become the ultimate expression of imperial power's ability to reshape human identity itself. Nero's marriage to Sporus was just the beginning of his assault on Roman social conventions. The emperor seemed determined to turn the entire concept of imperial dignity into his personal stage show. What came next would prove that Nero viewed his position not as a sacred trust but as a license to perform the most outrageous acts imaginable for public consumption. These weren't private scandals hidden behind palace walls. Nero deliberately orchestrated his marriages as massive spectacles designed to shock and dominate Roman society. He understood that his power meant he could force an entire empire to participate in his personal fantasies, no matter how twisted or humiliating. The marriage ceremonies themselves became elaborate productions. Nero hired musicians, poets, and performers to celebrate his union with Sporus as if it were the greatest love story in Roman history. He commissioned songs praising the beauty of his boy bride and had artists create paintings showing him and Sporus as the ideal imperial couple. But the emperor wasn't finished challenging Roman masculinity and social order. Sources describe how Nero later entered into another marriage where he took the female role himself. This time he married a freedman named Pythagoras, in a ceremony where Nero played the bride. The emperor wore women's clothing, was given away like a traditional Roman wife, and even mimicked the cries of a virgin on her wedding night. This role reversal represented the ultimate violation of Roman values. The emperor, who should have embodied masculine authority and dignitas, was publicly performing as a submissive female. Nero forced his court to witness him being penetrated and dominated by a former slave, completely inverting every expectation of imperial behavior. These marriages weren't spontaneous acts of passion or private lifestyle choices. They were carefully choreographed political theater designed to demonstrate Nero's absolute authority over social norms. By forcing senators and military commanders to attend these ceremonies, applaud his choices, and treat his relationships as legitimate, Nero was showing that his power extended beyond law and custom into the very fabric of Roman identity. The emperor seemed to delight in watching powerful men squirm as they were forced to congratulate him on his marriage to a castrated boy or his performance as a submissive bride. Each ceremony became a test of loyalty where attending dignitaries had to choose between maintaining their moral principles and keeping their heads attached to their necks. Contemporary accounts describe the visible discomfort of wedding guests who found themselves trapped between social disgust and political survival. Senators who had spent their lives defending Roman tradition were forced to smile and toast the emperor's union with Sporus, or watch Nero submit to Pythagoras like a blushing teenager. These performances also served as warnings to anyone who might challenge Nero's authority. The message was clear. If the emperor could remake a boy into an empress and transform himself into a bride, he possessed unlimited power over everyone's fate. Today's respected senator could become tomorrow's castrated plaything if he dared oppose the imperial will. The sheer audacity of making these marriages state occasions rather than private affairs showed Nero's genius for psychological manipulation. He wasn't just breaking taboos, he was forcing an entire empire to become complicit in breaking them alongside him. The Roman establishment's response to Nero's marriages revealed just how far imperial power had corrupted the Republic's ancient institutions. What should have triggered immediate revolt instead produced a paralyzed silence from men too terrified to speak truth to absolute authority. Senators who had once debated the fate of nations now found themselves reduced to wedding guests at ceremonies that violated every principle they claimed to uphold. These powerful men, descendants of those who had overthrown kings and founded the Republic, sat quietly while their emperor married a mutilated child and played bride to a former slave. The Senate's inability to respond effectively to Nero's behavior exposed the complete hollowness of Roman republican institutions. When faced with an emperor who treated the empire as his personal theater, the supposed guardians of Roman values revealed themselves as impotent spectators willing to applaud any atrocity to preserve their own comfort. But the silence wasn't universal. Contemporary sources describe whispered conversations in private homes, coded criticisms shared among trusted friends, and growing networks of discontent among both the elite and common citizens. The emperor's marriages had become symbols of everything wrong with imperial rule. Military commanders found themselves in particularly impossible positions. These men, who had sworn oaths to defend Roman honor and dignity, were expected to salute an emperor who publicly debased himself and turned the imperial title into a mockery. Some began quietly discussing alternatives to Nero's continued rule. The marriages also triggered a broader crisis of legitimacy throughout the empire. Provincial governors reported increasing difficulty maintaining Roman authority when their emperor's behavior became the subject of jokes and disgust among conquered peoples. How could they demand respect for Roman law and culture when Rome itself was ruled by a man who married boys and performed as a woman? Even more disturbing was the realization that Nero's actions set precedents for future emperors. If one ruler could force an entire empire to accept his marriage to a castrated child, what other violations of human dignity might his successors attempt? The emperor had opened doors that could never be fully closed again. Common citizens, already struggling with Nero's heavy taxation and neglect of basic governance, found his personal scandals the final proof that their ruler cared nothing for their welfare. The same man who forced them to pay for his architectural fantasies was now spending their money on elaborate wedding ceremonies celebrating relationships that violated basic human decency. The marriages became rallying points for various conspiracies against Nero's rule. Plotters used the emperor's relationship with Sporus as evidence that he was unfit to hold power, while his submission to Pythagoras became proof that he had abandoned his duty to embody Roman masculine authority. Yet even as opposition grew, many Romans found themselves trapped in a horrifying complicity with Nero's actions. Palace servants who dressed Sporus as an empress, musicians who performed at the wedding ceremonies, and artists who create Rome burned for 6 days straight. While flames devoured entire neighborhoods and people fled screaming through smoke-filled streets, witnesses reported seeing the emperor himself performing on his private stage, not helping with rescue efforts, not coordinating emergency responses, singing. The year was 64 AD, and the Great Fire of Rome would consume nearly 2/3 of the city. But what Nero did during those 6 days has sparked debates for nearly 2,000 years. Ancient historians like Tacitus and Suetonius painted him as a monster who played music while his subjects died. Others claimed he wasn't even in the city when the flames started. The truth sits somewhere in this smoke-filled chaos, and it's far more complex than the simple story of a mad emperor fiddling while Rome burned. First, let's destroy that famous image. Nero couldn't have fiddled because fiddles didn't exist in ancient Rome. The instrument wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. What he likely played, if anything, was a lyre or a cithara, both popular instruments among the Roman elite. This detail matters because it shows how myths about Nero have grown and twisted over centuries. The fire began in the Circus Maximus area, spreading rapidly through the wooden shops and apartments that packed Rome's poorest districts. Dry summer winds pushed the flames across the city faster than people could escape. Ancient sources describe scenes of absolute horror. Families trampled in narrow streets, buildings collapsing in showers of sparks, the Tiber River clogged with people desperately trying to cool their burned skin. Nero was reportedly in Antium, about 35 miles south of Rome, when the fire started. He rushed back to the city, but by then the damage was catastrophic. Some accounts suggest he opened his own gardens to refugees and organized relief efforts. Others paint him as callously indifferent to the suffering around him. The historical record here becomes frustratingly unclear, clouded by the biases of writers who despised everything Nero represented. What we do know is that Nero saw opportunity in the ashes. While bodies were still being pulled from collapsed buildings, he was already planning his architectural masterpiece. The fire had cleared vast areas of prime real estate, and Nero intended to use every scorched acre for his personal glory. This wasn't just urban renewal. This was the chance to rebuild Rome as a monument to himself. The emperor's response to the disaster revealed the twisted logic of absolute power. Rather than focusing solely on helping survivors, he balanced relief efforts with his own grandiose vision. Public funds that could have gone to housing refugees were earmarked for his building projects. Emergency shelters were temporary, but his palace would be eternal. Rumors spread through the refugee camps that Nero had started the fire deliberately. People whispered that they had seen Imperial guards preventing bucket brigades from fighting the flames in certain areas. Some claimed they witnessed men with torches moving systematically through neighborhoods, spreading the fire rather than fighting it. These accusations were never proven, but in a city where half the population was suddenly homeless, they didn't need to be proven to be believed. The emperor's behavior during the crisis became a symbol of everything Romans had learned to hate about his rule. Whether he actually performed music during the fire or simply failed to project appropriate grief, his actions cemented his reputation as a ruler who prioritized spectacle over substance. The Great Fire of Rome became Nero's fire, and he would never escape that association. From the ashes of Rome, Nero envisioned a golden palace that would make every other building in the empire look like a peasant's hut. The Domus Aurea, his golden house, would stretch across nearly 300 acres of prime Roman real estate. But this wasn't just architecture, this was megalomania carved in marble and plated in gold. The palace complex was designed to be a city within a city, complete with artificial lakes, sprawling gardens, and a 120-foot bronze statue of Nero himself. The main banquet hall featured a rotating ceiling that showered guests with flower petals and perfume. Walls were covered in gold leaf and precious stones, while elaborate frescoes depicted the emperor as various gods and heroes. Every surface was designed to reflect Nero's glory back at whoever dared to look. Construction began almost immediately after the fire, while thousands of Romans were still living in temporary shelters. The emperor requisitioned the best materials from across the empire: marble from Greece, gold from Spain, exotic woods from Africa. Skilled craftsmen were pulled from rebuilding projects to work on the palace instead. The message was clear: Nero's comfort mattered more than his people's suffering. The scale of the Domus Aurea was unprecedented even by Roman standards. The complex included multiple dining rooms, each designed for different types of entertainment. One room featured mechanical devices that could change the decor between courses. Another had walls that could slide apart to reveal hidden chambers. The private baths were larger than most public buildings, fed by aqueducts diverted from the city's water supply. What made the project particularly obscene was its timing. While Nero was selecting gold fixtures for his bedchambers, entire neighborhoods remained in ruins. Families who had lost everything in the fire watched massive construction crews building fountains and pavilions for the emperor's pleasure. The contrast between private luxury and public suffering became impossible to ignore. The palace's most notorious feature was its entrance hall, which housed that colossal bronze statue of Nero. The emperor's image, depicted as the sun god Apollo, dominated the city skyline. Visitors approaching the palace would see Nero's face first, towering above everything else in Rome. The statue wasn't just decoration, it was a statement about who really mattered in the empire. Roman senators and nobles were forced to attend elaborate dinner parties at the Domus Aurea, where they would praise the emperor's taste while calculating the cost of each golden cup. These gatherings became exercises in enforced humiliation, as guests were expected to admire the very excess that was bankrupting the empire. The palace's luxury was built on their taxes, and everyone knew it. The construction project drained the imperial treasury faster than Nero could fill it. New taxes were imposed to fund the palace, while existing levies were increased to cover the imported materials. Provincial governors were ordered to send more tribute, straining the empire's relationships with conquered territories. The Golden House was becoming a golden noose around Rome's neck. Contemporary accounts describe the palace as simultaneously magnificent and repulsive. The craftsmanship was undeniably spectacular, but the circumstances of its creation made it a symbol of imperial excess. Even Nero's supporters struggled to justify the project's cost when so many Romans were still rebuilding their lives. The Domus Aurea represented everything wrong with Nero's understanding of power. It was beautiful, expensive, and completely disconnected from the needs of the people who paid for it. The emperor's architectural ambitions went beyond mere luxury. He wanted to reshape Rome itself according to his vision, with the palace as its golden heart. But every day the construction continued. More Romans turned against their emperor. The Domus Aurea was supposed to be Nero's crowning achievement, but it became the foundation of his downfall. The crack in Nero's power appeared in Gaul, where Julius Vindex raised the first serious rebellion against the emperor's rule. The provincial governor publicly declared that Rome deserved better than a singing, dancing tyrant who cared more about his palace than his people. Other provinces began to whisper similar thoughts, and whispers in the Roman Empire had a way of becoming armies. Word of the rebellion reached Rome in early 68 AD, and Nero's initial response revealed how completely he had lost touch with reality. Instead of immediately mobilizing the legions, he spent days planning elaborate stage performances to win back public support. The emperor seemed to believe that his subjects' loyalty could be purchased with entertainment, just as he had always bought everything else with gold. The Senate, sensing weakness, began to distance themselves from Nero's regime. These were the same men who had applauded his speeches and praised his artistic talents when his power seemed unshakable. Now they met in small groups discussing alternatives to the emperor they no longer trusted to protect the empire. The political calculations that had once favored Nero were rapidly shifting against him. Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared himself emperor and began marching toward Rome with his legions. This wasn't just another provincial rebellion. This was a direct challenge to Nero's authority from within the Roman establishment. The Praetorian Guard, supposedly the emperor's most loyal troops, began to waver as reports arrived of legion after legion declaring for Galba. Nero's response to the crisis was characteristically theatrical. Rather than addressing the political and military challenges facing his regime, he focused on dramatic gestures and public performances. He appeared before crowds in Rome, not to discuss the rebellion but to recite poetry and sing songs of his own composition. The emperor seemed to believe that his artistic talents could somehow overcome armed rebellion. The situation deteriorated rapidly as more provinces declared against Nero. His attempts to raise new legions failed when potential recruits refused to serve under a commander they no longer respected. The emperor's reputation for excess and cruelty had finally caught up with him, and loyalty that had been purchased with gold and fear proved worthless when his enemies offered better terms. 15 centuries of storytelling turned Nero into history's favorite monster, but the truth is messier than the myths. Every textbook paints him as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, yet the fiddle wouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. The real Nero played the lyre, and he wasn't even in the city when the flames started. These aren't small details getting lost in translation. They're deliberate distortions that reveal how history gets weaponized by those who survive to write it. 3 Roman historians shaped everything we think we know about Nero: Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. None of them were neutral observers. Tacitus despised the imperial system entirely, viewing it as the death of the Roman Republic. Suetonius wrote scandalous biographies designed to titillate wealthy Romans with tales of imperial excess. Cassius Dio wrote his account more than a century after Nero's death, recycling decades of accumulated gossip and propaganda. These men weren't historians in our modern sense. They were political commentators with axes to grind. The Senate had every reason to demonize Nero posthumously. After his suicide, they needed to justify their betrayal of an emperor who had actually been popular with Rome's lower classes. Nero gave public games, built public baths, and provided grain distributions to the poor. The aristocrats who eventually destroyed him couldn't admit they'd overthrown a ruler loved by ordinary Romans. Easier to paint him as a madman whose every action stemmed from insanity rather than calculated political choices. Modern archaeology keeps undermining the traditional Nero narrative. The Domus Aurea, his supposedly decadent golden palace, included revolutionary architectural techniques that influenced building design for centuries. Recent excavations reveal sophisticated engineering, private gardens open to the public, and artistic innovations that rival anything from the Renaissance. The palace wasn't just a monument to ego. It was a technological marvel that showcased Roman engineering at its peak. Even Nero's relationship with Sporus gets distorted by ancient bias and modern assumptions. Roman writers focused on the sexual scandal because it fit their narrative of imperial decadence. They ignored the political implications entirely. Emperors didn't make random personal choices. Every public action carried state significance. Sporus appeared at official ceremonies, wore imperial regalia, and received honors typically reserved for legitimate empresses. This wasn't private perversion made public. It was deliberate political theater designed to communicate imperial power over social boundaries. The castration itself, while undeniably brutal by today's standards, operated within Roman legal frameworks. Emperors routinely ordered executions, forced marriages, and body modifications for political purposes. Claudius had his wife Messalina executed for political adultery. Caligula forced senators to prostitute their wives for entertainment. Augustus exiled his own daughter for sexual misconduct that threatened dynastic succession. Nero's treatment of Sporus was cruel, but it wasn't uniquely cruel within the context of imperial power structures. Recent scholarship suggests we've been asking the wrong questions about Nero entirely. Instead of debating whether he was mad or evil, Historians now examine how imperial propaganda machinery worked in ancient Rome. Nero's story becomes a case study in how political enemies craft lasting character assassinations. The emperor who married a man twice wasn't necessarily a sexual deviant or a madman. He might have been a skilled politician using shocking personal choices to distract from military failures and economic problems his government couldn't solve through conventional means. Understanding Nero requires accepting that ancient Romans lived in a world where absolute power created its own moral universe. Emperors weren't bound by laws that governed ordinary citizens. They existed above social conventions, religious restrictions, and sexual norms. When you control life and death for millions of people, marrying a castrated boy becomes just another expression of unlimited authority. The real question isn't whether Nero was evil. It's whether any human being can wield absolute power without eventually using it in ways that horrify later generations. Nero's ultimate legacy isn't the fiddle myth or the burning Rome legend. It's the demonstration that political theater and personal identity can merge so completely that distinguishing between the two becomes impossible. Every emperor after Nero had to navigate the precedent he set, that imperial power could reshape not just law and society but the fundamental categories of gender, marriage, and family. He didn't just rule Rome, he redefined what ruling could mean. The emperor who married men twice understood something about power that his critics missed entirely. Authority isn't just about controlling armies or taxation or territorial expansion. Real power means the ability to make the impossible seem inevitable, to force society to accept what it considers unacceptable, to transform personal desires into state policy without explanation or justification. Nero's marriages weren't symptoms of madness. They were masterclasses in the exercise of absolute authority. When Nero forced the Roman world to witness his wedding to Sporus, he wasn't just satisfying personal whims, he was demonstrating that imperial power could override biology, tradition, religion, and common sense simultaneously. The boy walking beside him in Empress regalia represented the ultimate triumph of political will over natural law. Citizens who watched that ceremony learned that their emperor could reshape reality itself through sheer force of authority. This is why Nero's story still unsettles us 2 millennia later. We want to believe that power has limits, that certain boundaries can't be crossed even by those who control armies and treasuries. Nero's reign proved otherwise. He showed that sufficiently concentrated authority recognizes no restrictions beyond its own imagination. The castration, the marriage ceremonies, the public appearances, the imperial honors given to Sporus, all of it flowed logically from a single premise, that emperors could remake the world according to their private desires. Modern democracies exist partly as a reaction to rulers like Nero. We divide power among branches of government, establish constitutional limits, and maintain independent institutions specifically to prevent any individual from wielding the kind of absolute authority that made Nero's marriages possible. Yet his story remains relevant because the fundamental tension between personal power and social constraint never disappears entirely. Every generation has to decide how much authority to grant its leaders and what happens when those leaders use that authority in unexpected ways. Nero's legacy lives on every time we debate the limits of executive power, the relationship between private behavior and public office, or the role of spectacle in political life. He proved that politics and performance could merge so completely that separating them became meaningless. His reign demonstrated that power without accountability eventually transforms everything it touches, including the most basic human relationships. The emperor who married men twice didn't just change Roman history, he changed how we think about the relationship between authority and identity, between public roles and private desires, between what rulers can do and what they should do. The real horror of Nero's story isn't the cruelty or the excess. It's the recognition that absolute power makes everything possible and nothing sacred.